The Peter Schiff Show.
Today, we finally got the first estimate for U.S. GDP growth in the first quarter of 2019. And typically, the first quarter of the year has been rather weak. That has been the experience pretty much going back through the Barack Obama administration. And the consensus was for a 2.3% rise in first quarter GDP. That would have been just a slight improvement over the 2.2 number that we got for the fourth quarter of 2018. Although, if you remember, way back, I don't know, a couple months ago, everybody was really low. I mean, you had a lot of people that were looking for Q1 GDP to come out with a zero handle. But they had been ratcheting up those expectations up now to a consensus of 2.3. A lot of it had to do with the fact that the trade deficits had come in a lot smaller than people thought. And I think the reason for that is because the trade deficits really ramped up in the last couple of quarters, probably because businesses were trying to front run the tariffs that were supposed to come in at the end of last year. And so that might have caused extra imports to try to, get things in under the gun before they were subjected to the tariffs. And so because we pulled all that forward, imports weren't as much in the first quarter. And so they did not subtract as much from the GDP. Also, the inventories continue to build, but most importantly, because they weren't selling. I mean, goods weren't selling as much, but the inventories were building. That also ended up helping. And so we ended up getting a number that was much bigger than consensus. We actually got 3.2% GDP growth for Q1. Now, before you get all excited, aha, Peter, you were totally wrong on this. You were looking for a weak number. First of all, a lot of people were looking for a weak number. It wasn't just me, but I do believe that we simply delayed the day of reckoning by a quarter. I think this time it's going to be the second quarter that's going to be a big disaster. I mean, we may even get a negative number in Q2. And the reason for that is, number one, we're not going to get the positive contribution from smaller trade deficits. We're also not going to get the contribution from inventories. But I think the biggest hurdle or the biggest problem is going to be the deflator, the inflation number. Because the real reason that GDP was 3.2% was because the government's version of inflation, the GDP deflator, that's the number that they use to take a nominal number and make the real number. And they report the real number, right? Not the nominal number. And in the fourth quarter of last year, according to the government, the annualized rate of inflation was 1.7%. So that's what they use to deflate the nominal number. Well, in the first quarter of this year, according to the government, that number, the price deflator, was just 0.9. 0.9, that's the annualized rate of inflation. So the government says that in the first quarter of this year, the annualized rate of inflation was not even 1%. And as a result of that, the real number was much larger. Had the deflator remained the same in Q1 of this year as it was in Q4 of last year, then the GDP would have been 2.4, which would have been pretty close to the consensus. Now, the question is why? Because, when I first look at these numbers, it's like, come on, give me a break. I mean, oil prices exploded in the first quarter of 2019. In fact, they rose by 33%. In contrast, in the fourth quarter of last year, oil prices crashed by 38%. So, I mean, how do we have more inflation in the fourth quarter of last year when oil prices collapsed than we did in the first quarter of this year when oil prices surged? And then, in fact, if you actually look at the energy number that was used, the government claimed that energy prices dropped by 17% in the first quarter. Now, is this just a complete fabrication? Or maybe it's possible that what happened was that oil prices dropped dramatically in the fourth quarter of last year, but it didn't affect the prices that consumers paid until the first quarter. So in the first quarter, consumers got a lot of the benefit of the big drop in oil prices that occurred in the prior quarter. But that means that in Q2, consumers are now going to feel the pain of the increases in energy prices and oil prices that we saw in the first quarter of this year, which means that the deflator is going to be a much, much bigger number in Q2 than it was in Q1 because it's going to have to incorporate that huge increase in energy prices. And so that means that it's going to be a bigger subtraction from whatever the nominal GDP number is. So when you take that into effect and take into effect that we're not going to have the contributions from inventories, we're not going to have the contributions from trade, we could be looking at a very, very weak number in the second quarter. So instead of the first quarter being the real weak one, we end up with an extremely weak second quarter. So don't get too excited. I know Donald Trump was out there tweeting immediately how great this is, right? It is the best first quarter in 4 years. You have to go back to 2015 to find a first quarter that was this good. Of course, Barack Obama was president then, so there was a Q1 that was strong when he was president too, but it didn't persist throughout the entire year, and that's not going to be the case this year. There is a lot of bad news that is going to be weighing down the economy. There was news on new home sales that came out earlier in the week, and that was an unexpected pop. I mean, it was a better number than people had been anticipating. Of course, the housing numbers have been very weak. So why was it that all of a sudden there was a big jump in new home sales? And of course, the markets reacted to this. Oh, this is great. You see, the news isn't really that bad because new home sales are, spiked until you actually look beneath the surface. When you do that, you'll see that the reason that there was a big increase in sales of new homes is because builders finally threw in the towel and slashed prices. I mean, you had a huge collapse in the price of new homes. I think down over 10% year over year. And it's the lower prices that cause the sales, which makes sense, right? It's supply and demand. I mean, you have more demand if you lower prices. But obviously, if home builders are slashing their prices in order to move their inventory, that is a very bad sign for the housing market. Number one, it means the home builders are not making as much money on their homes, right? They had to build them and now they had to cut the prices. So that's not good for home building stocks or their profits. But of course, if home builders can't make a good profit selling a home, well, then they're going to stop building, right? So it's bad for the whole industry. If you work in that sector, well, you may not have a job if home builders can't build a home and then sell it at a high enough price to make a profit. And of course, this may just be the beginning of the price cuts. I mean, prices could be cut a lot more. Now, of course, the existing home sales, they may not have as rapid a price cut because people have to contend with mortgages. And then if you try to sell the house for less than your mortgage, you maybe need permission of the bank to do a short sale. But the builders in general are just going to sell the houses for whatever they can get because they have to move the merchandise. So I read this article, though, about a home that sold in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is not too far from where my house is in Connecticut, although I'm not in Greenwich. But this house apparently had been on the market for about 3 years. The guy who owns it had moved down to Florida, in part to get away from the high taxes of Connecticut. But of course, that means that anybody buying his home would be assuming that tax burden. And there's not a lot of people that want to move into high tax states, especially when they have a lot of debt, which means their high taxes are going to get higher. So this guy had been trying to sell his house for a few years. I think he started at 4 or 5 million, and he's cut the price several times. And then he decided to auction it off, right, to the highest bidder. And it ended up selling at the reserve bid, which I think was $1.8 million. Now, that may sound like a lot of money to some people, but for a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, it's chicken feed. I mean, this thing collapsed in price. And of course, the houses in Connecticut, and I know that I live there, I mean, houses are lower than they were probably 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of inflation in the last 20 years, but you could buy houses in Fairfield County, Connecticut, for less than they cost back then. I mean, obviously houses, depreciate, you think, but they're probably well maintained in Connecticut. And obviously too, the prices did go up. And if you look at where the market was, Connecticut probably peaked out 2005, 2006. So since then, housing prices have more than halved, in some cases substantially more. And so this is going to be happening, though. This is not just a phenomenon that's going to be happening in Connecticut. I mean, housing prices are going to be coming down all over the country. I mean, Connecticut has some particular problems. I mean, a lot of these high tax states right now, the taxes are no longer deductible on your federal income tax, the SALT taxes. So that was a major tax increase and a reason to get the hell out of the state. But there's another reason now. These morons in the Connecticut legislature, now they have a plan to raise taxes yet again, right? They're saying they need to raise taxes to help the poor, right? Well, you know what? If raising taxes helped the poor, there'd be no poor people left in Connecticut anymore because they keep raising taxes. They want to raise the sales tax. Yeah, how's that going to help the poor? Don't the poor pay the sales tax? Yeah, so the government's going to take their money and then give it back to them and claim they're helping them, right? But they also want to raise the capital gains tax on the rich. And they describe the rich as anybody who earns a $500,000 a year if they're single, or $1 million a year if they're married. And what they want to do is add a surcharge of 2%. So right now the capital gains tax is about 7%, I think 6.9, and so they're going to raise it to almost 9%. And that means they'll be taxing capital gains higher than they tax ordinary income, which very few states, I don't think, maybe one other state might do that, but that's very rare. In fact, the federal government, it's the opposite, right? They tax capital gains at a lower rate than the rate on ordinary income, but Connecticut wants to tax it at a higher rate, which of course is going to chase even more high income families, particularly a lot of these hedge fund guys that still reside in Greenwich, right? They make most of their income on carried interest in their funds, which is taxed at the capital gains rate. And so this is yet another reason to get out of Connecticut and put your home on the market. And it is fewer people who are going to be coming to Connecticut to buy the houses that everybody is trying to unload. No, too, I forgot to mention, I talked about the big increase that we had in oil prices in the first quarter of this year. Well, we had a pretty decent drop in the price of oil today. Crude oil prices dropped better than $2 a barrel. So we're back down to 62.88. And the catalyst was Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump came out and announced, I don't know if he tweeted it or just there was a press release, but he said that he called up the Saudis because he doesn't like where the oil price is. He wants the oil price to come down, and apparently the Saudis are cooperating. And Donald Trump says, see, the prices are already starting to fall as a result of my phone call to the Saudis. Now, I have no idea what Trump talked about on this phone call. I mean, whether or not he's just saying this. I mean, Donald Trump tends to have, I guess, maybe and sometimes the same problem with the truth that the bartender has, right? That you don't necessarily always have to be factually accurate. So who knows? But he was able to talk the price of oil down. But remember, Trump has been talking the price of oil down during the entire rally, right? He recognizes that rising oil prices take a bite out of consumer spending, which takes a bite out of an economy that's based on consumer spending. So he is trying to do whatever he can to talk the price of oil down. But that is inconsistent with his other goal, right? He's also trying to talk interest rates down, right? He's bashing the Fed for being too tight. He wants the Fed to be more accommodative. He wants the Fed to start cutting interest rates. He wants the Fed to do QE4, right? Well, if you want the Fed to print more money, right, and be easier, but you also want oil prices to go down, those two goals are mutually exclusive. Because when the Fed starts printing more money, when the Fed, lowers interest rates, oil prices are going to go ballistic, right? And so Trump maybe doesn't realize that, but that's what's going to happen. And I don't think Trump is going to get his wish when it comes to lower oil prices, but I do think he's going to get his wish when it comes to an easier Fed. The question is, when is the Fed going to start cutting? I mean, so far, the Fed has not had to do that because the dollar, right? The dollar hasn't really started to fall yet. We haven't really started to see a more pronounced deterioration ever since the Fed announced that it would no longer hike rates. But the reason that that's been able to work thus far is because a lot of other central banks are backing off from their tightening, right? Everybody is getting dovish. It's a dove fest. Look what just happened in Canada. Look at Sweden. I mean, they've still got negative interest rates in Sweden, and they were supposed to hike rates. So was Canada, and now everybody who was supposed to hike rates is saying, "Well, we're not going to hike them." Everybody is getting more easy on their monetary policy, and that is taking some of the pressure off of the dollar and the Fed, because if everybody else is backing away from their contemplated tightening, well, then the Fed on a relative basis is not easier than it used to be. Except as inflation really rears its head around the globe, which it is going to do, right? I mean, that's why we've been seeing oil prices rise despite Trump's efforts to talk them down. And it's not going to be just oil prices. Lots of prices are going to be going up. A lot of these other central banks are going to be forced out of their easy money stance. They're going to have to hike interest rates, but America will not. America is going to resist that temptation, or not even a temptation. They're just not going to do it because we can't afford it because of the enormity of the debt that we have and how higher interest rates would impact this economy. That's why the Federal Reserve is already trying to lay the foundation for the markets and investors to accept higher inflation. In fact, to be rooting for higher inflation. In fact, one of the reasons, or the way the markets originally reacted to the GDP numbers that came out, gold went up today. I mean, gold was up about $10. See, normally when the economic news is better than expected, you would expect gold to go down. The dollar fell today. The stronger than expected GDP, and it was much stronger than expected, the dollar went down. It didn't go up. And bond yields went down, not up. Bonds were bought on stronger economic growth. Now, why is that? Well, the reason I think is because the markets were looking at the deflator and saying, wait a minute, there's less inflation. That means there's another reason, there's another excuse for the Federal Reserve not to have to hike interest rates because inflation is below their 2% number. And I think it was that low inflation number, even though it's clearly a transitory number based on the way it's being calculated. But I think the markets jumped on that and they bought bonds, they sold the dollar, they bought gold. And the stock market, again, had another positive day today. The Dow was up 81 points. Nasdaq up, up again on the week, and despite some pretty bad numbers that we got today, Intel got clobbered. It came out with some bad numbers, but not just Intel. We had 3M earlier in the week. 3M was actually down 12% on the week. Yesterday, UPS plunged. I think it ended up down 9% on the week. But these are kind of bellwether type stocks, right? Industrial stocks, transportation stocks, tech stocks that all had very, very weak earnings. And the stocks got clobbered. But, the markets continue to ignore that and continue to grind higher despite that, because there is all of this speculative fever. In fact, some of the recent IPOs like Pinterest, continue to make new highs. One that actually made new lows today was Lyft, right? It sank to a new low earlier today since it's been public, but it did manage a bit of a reversal to close up a little over 1%. The catalyst there, I think, for the new low, I don't know that this stock needs a catalyst to go lower. It's just going lower on its own. But there was some news on the Uber IPO. They have now reduced the valuation again. Now they're looking to take Uber public with an $84 billion valuation. Now, they were initially looking at like 110, 120 billion, and they keep lowering the bar, and now they're down to 84 billion. Something tells me the bar still isn't low enough, because the big problem with Uber is the Uber size, right, of their losses. I mean, you're talking about Uber losses over there at Uber. But another stock that's having Uber losses that is really starting to sink now is Tesla. Tesla was down another 5% today, a new 52-week low, $235. Remember, this stock had an all-time high of $387, and now we're down to 235. But if you look at a chart, right, we are potentially at a very critical level. And again, this is a big speculative story in this stock, and this stock has been held up by the cheap money that fuels the speculative fervor and has enabled this company to go up. But a stock like this breaking is a potential canary in a coal mine, and we've got lots of canaries in this coal mine that people have been ignoring as they drop dead one after another. I just put up on my YouTube channel about 3 weeks ago, on a day that Tesla had a big drop. I think it was down about 10% on some other bad news, but the stock was well above where it is now. I think it was like in the 260s, so about $30 higher. And I actually went on RT. They invited me on to talk about Tesla, because I don't really get invited on the mainstream to talk about anything, but RT had me on to talk about Tesla and their earnings. And I was very bearish. I said, look, Tesla's got a lot of problems and, people should sell. I mean, the smart money is short. And so I remembered I did that interview and I never put it up on my YouTube channel, but said Tesla hit a new 52-week low today and it was being talked about. I posted it so you can listen to my comments on Tesla. By the way, I actually just met Elon Musk's mother, May Musk. She was down here in Dorado, just on vacation with a group of people, and I had a chance to chat with her for a while. Very nice lady, very very attractive. She was a former model, and she aged quite well. Very fashionable, stylish woman. I don't know. I just thought I'd throw that out there. But I've never met Musk himself, but now I've met Mrs. Musk. I mentioned that gold was up today. It ended up closing up about $9. We're back above 1285, still below 1300. Gold was in the process of forming a head and shoulders top that might have projected gold down to around 1210, 1220, something like that. In fact, I learned about that head and shoulders from following my son Spencer on Twitter. He had put out the chart about the potential head and shoulders, and we did actually get below the neckline. But if we get back above that neckline, if this head and shoulders pattern does not play out, if it's a busted head and shoulders, that is extremely bullish because head and shoulders tops, or bottoms, they're generally pretty reliable. So most of the time you get a head and shoulders top, the market, the pattern, plays out and you get the bigger drop. Now, the interesting thing that even, my son pointed out is that if we get the big drop, we're just going to take gold back down to the uptrend line. So it's still in a positive long-term pattern, even if in the short run, it might have pulled back to satisfy the head and shoulders pattern. But obviously, head and shoulders patterns don't always work. I mean, if they always work, then you could make money every time, right? Just find a head and shoulders top and you're guaranteed to make money, or find a head and shoulders bottom and buy it and you're guaranteed to make money. You're not. I mean, most of the time they work out, but not all the time. And what is probably even more reliable than the head and shoulders pattern is when it doesn't work. When it breaks the neckline, but then doesn't fulfill the pattern and goes back the other way. In the case of a top, it could portend a huge rally. So potentially that is what's coming in gold. But I think we still need to move a little bit higher before we, bust that potential pattern. Although while real gold was moving up today, digital fool's gold was moving in the other direction. Bitcoin had a big drop yesterday, overnight, today. We had gotten as high as I think about 5,600 on the price of Bitcoin, maybe a little higher. And then we tanked yesterday. The catalyst was a news story that the Attorney General in New York had basically filed charges or a lawsuit against Bitfinex, Tether, having to do with fraud. And I've talked about this on this podcast before. There's a lot of smoke that's been out there on Tether and Bitfinex. And normally, where there's smoke, there's fire. And what I think is being alleged in this lawsuit is that there was an $800 million loss at Bitfinex that was covered up by basically embezzling money out of Tether, because Tether is the cryptocurrency that is tied to the dollar. So it's a stable coin, one for one with the dollar. And so it's backed by all the dollars that are held in reserve. But what the lawsuit is alleging is that they illegally took money out of that reserve to cover up their losses, which meant that there weren't dollars backing up the tethers. And so if the people that owned the tether had cashed them in, right, there wouldn't have been any dollars there to cash them out. And this has been, allegations about a lot of the big run up in the price of crypto back in 2017 was in part fueled by money maybe embezzled from Tether, and maybe that the tethers that were used to buy cryptocurrencies were just issued without any dollars actually backing them up. So, in other words, the demand that fueled the rally wasn't even legitimate because there was no real money because they were just counterfeiting tethers. So, here, more news shining a light, which was a reason to sell this rally. And if you look at the long term crypto chart, we're still in a bear market. I mean, this rally, I mean, yes, we were down near 3,000 and we rallied above 5,000, but we're not even nearly back above what used to be support. I mean, it used to be a lot of support was at 5,500, 6,000. Remember, that's where everybody said that, that's the main support. Well, we crashed through that. And when you talk about technical analysis, what used to be support, if it gives way, becomes resistance. And all we've really been able to do with Bitcoin all we've really been able to do with Bitcoin is rally back to what is now the resistance level. And now we've had a pretty big turn back down. In fact, I think we did move a little bit above a moving average, and now we're back below it. So the technicals are not looking good. Of course, a day or two ago, I saw Tommy Lee, the perennial Bitcoin bull on CNBC. Bitcoin is above 5,500. And he's like, the bottom is in. We're going way up. He was so excited about all the technicals and about how we were above this moving average that we're now below. I think it was the 200 day that he was referring to, but he was getting really bullish again on crypto, really at the top of what really is a bear market rally. And I think that bear market rally, has likely peaked out. We'll see. Right around 5,000 is where the low was. I think we touched below it briefly. As I'm recording this, we're now back around 5,100, but still down about 10% from the highs that we were trading at yesterday about this time. I want to talk a little bit of politics now because I think it was just yesterday. Joe Biden has now entered the fray. He has officially thrown his hat in the ring, and he is now a candidate for president. He's running, of course, in a crowded field of other Democrats. Now, of course, for a while there was, some problems. There were some women that were coming out and saying that, Uncle Joe was getting a little too frisky. He liked to smell their hair. I don't know. It seemed like they were trying to keep Joe from entering the primary because obviously he's the old guard. He's the establishment. He's an old white guy, right? He's not with it now. He's not progressive. He's not a socialist. I mean, maybe he is, but he's not he's still in the closet. He's not embracing socialism. He was the vice president under Barack Obama. Right now, I don't know why, people want to distance themselves from Obama like he's the old guard. I mean, first of all, I mean, he was black, right? I mean, so that's supposedly, represented progress. And, Biden, of course, is not being endorsed. Obama is not endorsing Joe Biden. Now, normally, a president would endorse his VP. I mean, that's part of the deal, right? I mean, you go along with your president, you play ball, you do what he wants, you're a cheerleader for him. And the quid pro quo is, when it's your turn to run, you get the endorsement. And Obama's not even endorsing it because I guess Obama, doesn't want to piss off the more liberal wing of the party, right? So he doesn't want to come out and endorse Biden, especially since Biden may not win. And so, he doesn't want to come out and back the loser. But, I guess one of the first lies of the Joe Biden campaign, because of course, there's going to be a lot more, right? That's all politicians do, right? How do you know when a politician is lying? His lips are moving, right? Well, the first lie that Joe Biden is told is that he said that the reason Barack Obama is not endorsing him is because he asked the president not to endorse him. Now, I don't believe that for a minute. There is no way that Joe Biden had a conversation with Barack Obama, and Obama said, "Hey, Joe, I'm going to endorse you." And then Joe Biden said, "No, no, Barack, that wouldn't be fair to the other candidates. Why don't you stay out of it and just let the voters decide?" There is no way that conversation took place. Basically, Biden has to come up with a lie to explain why Obama's not endorsing him. So that's a plausible lie. I told him not to. Now maybe he actually did tell him not to. because he knew that there was no way he was going to get the endorsement. Maybe, Barack Obama kicked him under the table and said, hey, this is what you got to tell me, right? So you have some kind of excuse as to why I'm not endorsing you. But anyway, that's his first lie, and it's the first of many. But again, I don't want to pick on Biden. He's not the only politician who's going to be lying. Again, they're all going to be lying. But this is going to be a real shit show, this Democratic primary, because everybody's got to go to everybody's left, right? It's like how far to the left you can go. It's like a gigantic socialist limbo, only you're moving left instead of moving down. The problem is you go so far to the left, you've lost the center, right? And again, if we are not in a recession in 2020 in November, and they've nominated someone on the far left, then obviously Trump could have a second term. If we are in recession, I don't care who they nominate, that person's going to win, right? That's why this is so scary, right? I know there are people that are, say, Peter, why is it that you want the U.S. economy to collapse, right? You talk like you want it to collapse. I do, because it's a bubble. I want the bubble to pop. That's what people don't understand. I mean, the longer this goes on, the worse it is. We are just digging ourselves into a gigantic hole. Why would I want to dig it deeper? I mean, that's what politicians want to do, because they don't want to deal with the problem. They want to kick the can down the road. I want to deal with the problem right now. I mean, I wanted to deal with it 5 years ago. I wanted to deal with it 10 years ago, because it's good for America to stop digging the hole. Let's stop taking on debt. Let's stop growing government. Let's repair the damage, right? I mean, if you are an alcoholic, stop drinking. Don't just drink more. Check yourself into rehab. That's what I want to do. So the sooner we can prick this bubble, the better. But of course, the danger now, right? And this is a real danger, which I get, is the bubble pops while the Republicans are in charge, they get the blame. Capitalism gets the blame, right or wrong, because Trump is now the face of capitalism. Even though he's not necessarily a real capitalist, he's the face of capitalism. He's also the face of shrinking government, even though he's made government bigger. He talks about deregulation, but what have we deregulated? Deficits are bigger. Government is spending more. I mean, what's conservative about that? What's, in theory, Republican about that? But that's what is going to get blamed for this. But you know what? Doesn't matter. Because even if we don't crash before the election, we're going to crash after. Trump is going to be at the helm of the Titanic when it hits the iceberg, right? There's no way we're going to avoid recession for another 6 years. I mean, I still don't think we're going to avoid it for another 2 years, but there's no way we're going to avoid it for six. And the next one is going to be the last one. The next one is going to be horrific, because when the Fed tries to come to the rescue with more QE and 0% interest rates, nobody is going to believe that it's a temporary policy. Nobody is going to believe they have an exit strategy, right? If they couldn't shrink a $4.5 trillion balance sheet, they'll never shrink a $10 trillion balance sheet. If they couldn't normalize interest rates after keeping them at zero for 8 years and with a $22 trillion national debt, they're not going to normalize interest rates with a $30 or $40 trillion national debt. I mean, imagine all the extra debt corporations are going to take on from where they already have if we're going to keep this bubble going. Imagine how much more student debt we're going to have, how much more auto debt, how much more credit card debt, how much deeper into debt are the states going to get, are the municipalities going to get. So no one is going to believe for a second that we're ever going to normalize rates, that we're ever going to shrink the balance sheet. It was that false belief that was providing support for the dollar. So the next recession is cataclysmic. So whatever it happens, it's going to be a disaster for the Republicans. So we might as well get it out of the way. And personally, I think it's better to get the socialists in office in 2020, where we have a shot to get rid of them in 2024, than let them come in 2024, because I think by then things are going to be so bad we may never get rid of them. But one point I wanted to make, though, about the election, about how ridiculous it's going to be, is the left forces people, right, to sign on to these crazy ideas, right, like the Green New Deal. But one of them, an old idea that has been resurrected, I don't even know if I've commented it on my podcast. I can't remember. I've been doing a lot of podcasts over the years, so I forget. And by the way, I mentioned earlier that I just put up on my YouTube channel my interview on RT from 3 weeks ago about Tesla. But a couple days ago, I posted the keynote speech I did at the New Orleans conference. in November of 2018. So it's about a half hour speech. That's up there. And I also put up a panel that I did. It was me and two other guys, and it was the bubble panel, boom bust bubble panel. So I put that up there. So you got those two new talks that you can watch on my YouTube channel. If you want to hear me live, I'm going to be at the Money Show in Las Vegas. I think that's the 10th through the 14th. So if you're in Vegas, you can see that. That's a free conference. I'm also going to be at a conference where you have to pay to attend, the SALT conference, which stands for Skybridge Alternative Asset. That one is also in Vegas. It's a few days earlier. It's the 7th through the 10th. So I'm going to be there. At SALT, I'm just going to be doing a debate, gold versus Bitcoin. I'm going to be actually doing a lot more at the Money Show, and of course, I'm going to have a booth there. We're going to have some of my reps from my LA office there, so you should stop by. But getting back to what I was discussing, so there's one topic that is now getting more news among the Democratic candidates is the idea about reparations for slavery. Now, if there was ever a completely nutty, crazy idea, slavery reparations is it. I mean, it is probably of all the dumb things that Democrats have come up with, this has got to be the dumbest. But all of a sudden, it's being resurrected. And a lot of these candidates are afraid to be against it. I mean, some of them are, right? Bernie Sanders was against it. Biden, I guess, would be. I don't know. But you got a lot of people that are actually believe that there should be reparations for descendants of slaves, that people who descended from slaves should receive some kind of a payment. And they try to claim that, well, the Germans paid reparations for the Holocaust. They did to the actual survivors of the Holocaust, not their great, 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 great grandchildren. Germany paid reparations, and the taxpayers who paid it were the Germans who were responsible for the Holocaust, right? I mean, the people who were living in Germany at the time that the Holocaust survivors got reparations, they were in Germany when they were in concentration camps. But here you have this crazy concept that the sins of the fathers, in fact, not the fathers, the great, 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 great grandfathers should be visited on the sons. This is complete nonsense. But I mean, I might as well just, beat this horse until it's dead and just talk about how utterly preposterous the notion of slavery reparations actually is. I mean, first of all, America has paid the price for slavery, right? I mean, we fought a war, right, over the expansion of slavery or slavery, however you want to say what the catalyst was for the Civil War. Clearly, slavery was a big part of it. Freeing the slaves was a big part of it. It happened in 1863. How many Americans died to end slavery? I mean, more Americans died in the Civil War than any other war we ever fought. So there was a big sacrifice to end slavery in America. Certainly the monetary cost. I mean, forget about the cost of in lives, the cost of waging the war, and then the cost of rebuilding the South. I mean, how much did that cost? I mean, so there already was a huge price paid to end slavery by the people who were alive at the time. And remember, too, the people who owned slaves, I mean, the slaves were freed. There was no compensation to the slave owner, right? They bought the slaves and then they were freed, right? So there was a monetary loss that took place at the time, right, by the people who actually owned the slaves. But the idea that now, 150 years later, that there should be some compensation to people who weren't even alive, whose grandparents weren't even alive when slavery existed, is nonsense. I mean, because first of all, who gets it, right? Who gets the reparation money, right? Well, I mean, do you actually have to prove that your ancestors were slaves? I mean, because there are a lot of blacks that live in America whose ancestors didn't get here until after slavery ended, right? A lot of blacks came, in 1870, 1880, 1890. There are blacks that came from other Caribbean islands, right? Their ancestors weren't slaves. At least they weren't slaves here. I mean, it's possible they were slaves someplace else, but they weren't slaves in America. But how do you know? And of course, a lot of blacks, I mean, they're not like every one of their ancestors wasn't black. I mean, you have a lot of blacks that are also part white, right? There's a lot of white blood in a lot of African Americans. I mean, I mentioned Barack Obama earlier. He's half white. I mean, people always talk about how he's the first black president, but he's half white. I mean, does Barack Obama get reparations? First of all, does he need reparations? But if he does he get them? right? I mean, because he's half white. I mean, does his white half pay the reparations to his black half? I guess that would even out, right? But how do you know? And first of all, too, not every white person owned slaves. First of all, right? I think very few people up north had slaves. I mean, maybe about 20, 25%, I guess, of the Southerners actually owned slaves. I mean, you had to be pretty rich to own a slave, right? I mean, the average white person down south did not have any slaves. So, I mean, why should white people who descended from white people who never owned slaves, why should they have to pay reparations? What did they do wrong? And first of all, what about me? I mean, I'm white, but none of my ancestors were in America at the time of slavery. All four of my ancestors came to this country, around 1900. All my parents, grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe. So I mean, I wasn't my roots don't trace. Nobody in the Schiff family, at least in my line, owned any slaves. Why should I pay reparations for slavery? And of course, lots of people can't trace their roots back down to that time period. So the whole idea is ridiculous because you don't know who's going to pay, and you don't know who's going to be the recipient. And look, there are a lot of blacks in America today who are doing very well. I mean, why should they get reparations? I mean, you have some very, very successful blacks in the United States making a tremendous amount of money, very successful. They need reparations. You got plenty of poor whites. Why should they have to pay reparations to blacks who are doing much better than they are? Right? I mentioned Barack Obama. What about Patrick Mahomes? He's probably going to end up being the highest paid football player in the NFL when he signs his next contract. I mean, he's half white too, right? I mean, does he get reparations? Because he's half black, right? Now, of course, you got athletes who are, all black, like LeBron James. I mean, does he need reparations? I mean, how much money does that guy have? Right? He needs to get reparations. This whole thing is nonsense. That there's somehow the ability to figure out which person is actually descended from slavery, and then which person is descendant from somebody who actually owned the slaves. Plus, another thing that people forget too is, of course, not all blacks were slaves even before they were freed in 1863. I mean, there were plenty of free blacks, I mean, particularly up north. And another thing that not everybody realizes is that there were some blacks that owned slaves. I mean, obviously it was in the minority, but there were some slave owner blacks. Now, so what if somebody is in America today and they are a ancestor of somebody who was black and actually owned a slave? Why should that person receive reparations when his ancestors were themselves slave owners, right? And as I said, the vast majority of white people didn't own any slaves at all, right? So why should they pay? But you know what? There actually were some white slaves in America, right? You didn't have to be black to be a slave. I mean, the vast majority of slaves in America were black, but there were some white slaves. So what if there's a white guy here in America or a white gal who is the descendant of a white slave? Why should that guy pay reparations to potentially the descendants of a black slave owner? But even then, it doesn't make it right. I am not responsible for the sins of my great 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 grandfather, and you are not bearing the suffering. This is the biggest irony of it all, right? And this is probably very politically incorrect of me to say this, but of course I will always say things that are politically incorrect. There is no question that the people who suffered the indignity of slavery, right, suffered. It was terrible to be a slave. I am not belittling the institution of slavery or saying that, hey, the slaves had it good, right? I mean, slavery, I would not want to be a slave, right? So let's just, I mean, maybe it wasn't as bad as some people think, right? It wasn't like, most slave owners were like abusing the hell out of their slaves because after all, they were valuable property, right? They had to maintain that property. Slaves cost a lot of money. And so if your slave got sick, you took care of him, her. You had to feed your slave. You had to rest your slave. You had to do various things, just like, people did. People had horses that they, not that I'm equating humans with horses, but look, people just didn't beat their horses. So in general, people weren't beating their slaves. But I'm not saying that slavery, it was good to be a slave. I'm clearly, it wasn't, right? So slaves suffered, no question about that. Slavery was bad, and the people who were slaves suffered that. But if you are the descendant of a slave, that suffering, the suffering of your ancestors, benefited you, benefited you. Americans alive today who have descended from slaves are lucky that their great, 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 great grandfather was a slave in America. Why? Because if he wasn't a slave in America, he probably would have been a slave in Africa, or he would have been a free person in Africa. See, first of all, most of the slaves that made their way to the United States, it's not like, these slaves were just running around free and we sent people over to Africa to capture them, running around the jungle, and we snatched them, from their tribes. Most of the slaves that made it here in the slave trade were slaves already in Africa. They had black masters in Africa, and those black owners sold the slaves to the whites who brought them to the United States. In fact, they went all over the world, not just to the United States. And so, if you descended from a slave in America, had your great 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 grandfather not come here, then you would have descended from him in Africa potentially, and so you would have been born in Africa instead of being born in America. And even if your ancestor wasn't a slave and he was caught and enslaved by the Americans, so you would have been the descendant of a free African. But does anybody believe that it's better to be born black in sub-Saharan Africa, right, than in the United States? I mean, come on. I mean, I don't care what period of time, whether it's today, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, being born black in America is better than being born black in sub-Saharan Africa. Forget about, for a while, South Africa, was probably maybe a good place to be, maybe not. But in general, you had it pretty bad. Your standard of living is much higher, even if you are on welfare in America, even if you're poor. That's probably better than your random shot at where you would be, right? If you were born in Africa, right? So if you took the typical African American, right, who was here today and said, well, are you glad you were born here, or would you rather have just randomly been born to parents in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Just randomly, right? I mean, so it's possible. Like, I'm not saying that every black African is poor, but in general, poverty is far more widespread, especially if you actually look at it objectively, not on a relative basis. I mean, how are people living in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, pretty damn bad, right? So people who are here, they have it lucky. I mean, they don't need to be paid reparations. The fact that they're in America, that's all they need. I mean, think about what most people's ancestors had to do to get here, right? They had to come here. My grandparents, had to come here in 1900. They had to, cross the Atlantic. The descendants of slaves were already here. Now, yes, the slaves themselves, they came in chains. That's bad. But their children, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, they didn't have to do that. They were already here. Thanks to that suffering, they were here. They got to be born in America, which at the time was the freest country in the world. It was a privilege. It was an honor, a benefit to have been born here. So you can thank your grandparents for being slaves and enduring that so that you could benefit from the freedoms and the opportunities in America. Now, the fact that Black Americans, maybe as a group, haven't benefited from those opportunities as much as other groups have, that doesn't mean that they're owed reparations. In fact, if anything, what a lot of the African Americans have to do is do some soul searching and realize that the reason that they're having such difficulty is not because their ancestors were slaves, but because they've been dumb enough to vote for liberal politicians who have enslaved them with the welfare state. That is what's chaining African Americans today is welfare, it's food stamps, it's aid to families with dependent children. It's all these laws that have been passed supposedly to help minorities, help black people. That is their biggest hindrance. All of these laws against discrimination, these anti-discrimination laws that actually create reasons to discriminate where there would be no reason absent these laws. So it's the Democratic Party itself. It's the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. That is the problem. Trying to say that we need money, more money. I mean, what was the Great Society? What was the war on poverty? What was the New Deal? We keep throwing more and more money at the problem, and the problem keeps getting bigger and bigger. And now the reparations is just the icing on the cake of stupidity. But this, again, is where we are in the Democratic Party. They give me something for nothing because this is really something for nothing. This is a reason, hey, I'm black, therefore I'm going to vote Democrat because I'm going to get something because I'm black, right? Just I'm going to get, because the average black voter probably thinks that, yeah, reparations means I get something, right? I get money given to me, right? So you're trying to buy the votes, the African American vote, you're trying to buy it with reparations because it's being paid by white people, right? I guess. But what could be more racist than that, right? I mean, you got a party trying to say, hey, we got to get rid of racism. Everybody has to be colorblind. Yet you're actually advocating taxing people because of the color of their skin and giving the money to other people because of their color of their skin. I mean, what could be a more racist concept than reparations for slavery? Because as I said, the slaves are long dead, and their ancestors have benefited from the fact that they were brought here in chains and suffered, and they got to be born here in freedom. So it's got nothing to do with slavery. It's got nothing to do with suffering. It's just about taking money from people who happen to be white and giving it to people who happen to be black or maybe more black than white to the extent that they've got some kind of mixed blood. But that is pure unadulterated racism. But instead of being rejected, right, by these so-called progressives, right, it is being embraced. So we'll see. This is going to be one of the litmus tests in the Democratic primary, right, of, how dumb can you go, right? How far left can you go as to whether or not you're willing to sign on to this or criticize it. And I don't think any Democrat is going to go out on a limb and actually talk about how stupid this whole concept is because they're afraid to alienate the black vote, because the black vote is going to be much more important in the primary than it is in the general election. Because, in the general election, I mean, the Republicans pretty much know they're barely going to get any of the black vote. I mean, they're going to vote in block and they're going to vote Democrat. Just like, I mean, the Jewish vote by and large goes Democrat. Although I think this next election, I mean, the Republicans might get a lot more of the Jewish vote than they typically get. I mean, they're not going to win the Jewish vote, but they may not lose it as overwhelmingly as they traditionally do. And we'll see if that happens with the black vote. But by and large, the Democrats know they own that. I mean, and so that's how come they can keep taking advantage of blacks because, they take their vote for granted. But in the primary, it's up for grabs, right? So in the primary, people have to find that vote, and they're afraid to stand up against the ridiculous concept of slavery reparations.